Historic comeback at just the right time. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking down the Oklahoma Sooners coming off the big comeback against Baylor, down 25. They rally and win 34-31. We've got our guy Jason Ray on the line. Please check out his work at Last Word on College Football. Jason, how you doing today?
Doing good, Mark. Doing good. I think the last time we talked, I had told you that the weather was crazy in Oklahoma. I think it maybe was in the 20s or 30s. As just in true form, a week later, here we are in the 70s. So kind of crazy, but it's still hard to believe it's November football. With the weather around here, but we're still in the thick of it.
Jason, I wish I could trade you a 70s for a 70s in temperature-wise, because I saw the 70s last 2 to 3 weeks ago, and it's gone for good, and we'll see it back maybe in April.
Yeah.
Oklahoma, Baylor. Baylor jumps out 28-3, 25-point lead. We do know it's the Big 12. We do know that it's maybe the best offense in college football, certainly one of the 5 best. So it was not shocking to me that Oklahoma came back, but still, 25 points. Historic, tied for the longest and the biggest comeback in program history. And if you're going to do it, why not do it when there's a college football playoff appearance on the line and not do it during some 8-4 season? So it came at the right time against the right team in the right situation.
Yeah, it really did, Mark. I think, watching, covering, supporting Oklahoma football, it's certainly not for the faint of heart the last 3 weeks. So if you have a heart condition or if you have high anxiety, parking in front of the TV may not be your best course of action. But yeah, for the first half, they played Oklahoma played about as bad as they could have played offensively and defensively. Jalen Hurts was not good. Turned the ball over twice, fumbled. He actually fumbled 3 times in the game, lost 2 of them, one of them in the first half, and a really bad interception. And Baylor was kind of doing whatever they want. Charlie Brewer was throwing the ball around a lot. Denzel Mims caught a couple of touchdown passes, and then he ran the ball in at least once that I remember. So defense wasn't playing well outside of the initial drive. They set Baylor 3 and out, and then Oklahoma got that field goal to start off 3-0. So you thought that they might have turned it around a little bit over the last couple of games, but then I think Baylor scored on 5 consecutive possessions. To your point of leading 28-3 and then ultimately 31-10 at half. And I think the Bears had 350, 360 yards, somewhere in that neighborhood in the first half of play, but then completely different. You expected Oklahoma to make some type of a game of it, certainly in the second half, to have too much talent, too much pride, too much on the line, not to. But I think what was surprising was, what really got them back into the game, Mark, is their defense was able to get stops in the second half. Obviously, they shut Baylor out in the second half. I believe 80 some yards of total offense that they gave up. One of the big things that they talked about it a lot on the Gamecast and locally here in Oklahoma, they've talked about it. What Grinch, his defense is predicated on is getting turnovers, and they've not forced a turnover in the last 5 games until Saturday. They were able to force a fumble late there in the third quarter as they were making the comeback, and then obviously the interception to end the game, which coincidentally the linebacker Nick Benito dropped the interception the previous play, and then the very next play he got it. So for as bad as Jalen Hurts was in the first half, he was equally as good in the second half. I think for all intents and purposes, the Heisman's pretty much over. I mean, at this point, I think you say that on one. He's Joe Burrow has a significant lead, but at the same side, Tua Tagovailoa had a pretty significant lead last year. Up until the last game of the year, and then certainly the SEC championship game where Kyler Murray won that. But I think at this point, the lead that Joe Burrow has over probably Justin Fields and Jalen Hurts are probably 2 and 3, I would think, at this point. So, but still, he's still. think he's still in the conversation with the way he played in the second half. 4 touchdowns all through the air. He ran for I think 124, so he's close to 1,000 yards rushing, and then he's up over 3,000 yards passing. So, I think he, I think he was finally able to let go. I don't know if you saw the post game. He's so workmanlike. He's so businesslike in his approach to the game, and how he handles his interviews. You saw him and Riley kind of jumping up and down and hugging and laughing. It's the most, positive emotion that you've seen out of him all year. So, I think that kind of his performance, I think he was, pretty proud of the way he played and the way he came back. And, I think, for Hurts, I think Riley's probably got him at his peak, right? I think anybody that watches him knows he's not at the Baker Mayfield level. He's not at the level of Kyler Murray, but he's played about as well as I think most fans would have expected him to. I think he's got now 28 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, completing about close to I think he's right around 69% of his passes. So so he's done well, but I think the offense is what it is, but being able to get those stops defensively, shut Baylor out for the entire second half. Not only bodes well, obviously, for that game, but for the rest of the season as they try to get back into the college football playoff discussion.
And we talked about it all off season, Jason, in trying to project what Jalen Hurts would mean to this offense in comparison to what we saw under Kyler Murray and Baker Mayfield. Those two guys, by most reasonable evaluations and measurements, were the very best at their positions for those particular seasons. They were the best.
Yeah.
There could be an argument that somebody else was maybe better. So they were the top 2 or 3, but I would say the best for 2017 and 18. We didn't think that Jalen Hurts would perform quite to that level, and to expect him to would just be not fair to him, but that he was certainly a top 15 quarterback in the nation, and he's certainly been at least that good and is produced. And I got to tell you this, Jason, I was having dinner with my son last night, and he said to me, you know who I like? And I said, who? He goes, I like that Jalen Hurts. And I said, yeah. And he said, he's just like laser focused, and it's all business. And basically, okay, this was a big comeback. That was great. But boom, it's in the rearview mirror already. It's already, hey, I'm all about winning championships. It's almost that Alabama pedigree in the back of his mind that, we play big games. This is what we do. We play big games. We win big games. It's on to the next one. It's about winning championships. And until we win the whole thing, it's just another step in the process. I'm not going to get too excited about it.
No, he's definitely not. It's it's hard to not like him, right? Even from the outside looking in, if you're not, certainly if you're not covering Oklahoma, you followed his story from Alabama. He's a hard kid not to like. A lot of people, when you go back and look at Baker, it's kind of easy if you're on the outside not to like him. Just because of his kind of flamboyant, especially now, he's kind of taking it maybe a step further in the NFL. But Jalen's a kid, the way he persevered through Alabama, the way he, a lot of kids at his stage would have left earlier, right? Especially after getting replaced in that national championship game. Probably 8 out of 10 kids now would have probably left. And then where would Alabama would have been? Certainly, and then you now look at it now, if he would have even stayed another year, now where would they have been? But that's certainly another discussion. But yeah, he's really I think he's a very difficult kid to not like. But I think at the same time, I think the media around here are so used to Baker. They're so used to, even Kyler to a certain extent was a little outgoing, specifically in terms of some comments that he made about Texas and Ellinger specifically. But there was some thoughts this week about the swagger's not there at the quarterback position. To your point, it's more of a business like, it's more of a workman like perspective. And I think he is winning over, I think, half by half. I think from time to time he is winning over the fan base. I think sometimes it takes a little bit. The Oklahoma fans are very, very temperamental and very, it's a blue blood program where they expect to win, and they expect to win now. There's no You look, there were fans that were calling for Spencer Rattler after halftime, which is absurd, of course. But then after the comeback, of course, then you talk about Hurts. He should be in there. He should be in contention for the Heisman. So it's one of those things. You're never going to be the most popular guy in most teams as the backup quarterback, and Rattler's not even the true backup at this point. But yeah, he's the consensus is I think he's a very hard kid not to like.
Jason, I also believe this was a good win for the Big 12 because of what the College Football Playoff Selection Committee told us the first 2 weeks of its rankings, that even though Baylor was undefeated, so I've got to think, let's say Baylor would have won that game, swept the regular season, won the conference championship, been undefeated as Big 12 champion, it would have been ludicrous to leave them out of the college football playoff. So they weren't given a whole lot of respect, but after 2 Oklahoma wins, a Texas win, they should have made so to deny an undefeated Power 5 champion, I can't imagine that happening. So from that standpoint, the loss not good for the Big 12 in regards to possibly having an undefeated team make it all the way through. But the committee had already told us that even with 1 loss versus a 0-loss Baylor team, that they were valuing Oklahoma as the better team by 3 spots, even with a loss. So they were valuing Oklahoma just to be flat out the better team by perception, by eyeball test, by the metrics, other than the wins and losses. And therefore, I think that Oklahoma is the better choice for Big 12 fans to carry the mantle. Obviously, they're going to have to complete it with the championship game win as well.
Yeah. I'll jump on my soapbox a little bit here with the college football rankings. I think, just my opinion this year, I think it's been worse this year than in any other year. You look at, Baylor. To your point, 3 spots behind Oklahoma, number 13, an undefeated Power 5 Big 12 leader at that point. How can they be behind two lost teams? I look at that, and we agree. I think in terms of the sentiment that at some point the games on the field, they have to matter. It doesn't. Not the name on the jersey. It has to be the team on the field that matters. And me and Mike Laval and Tony Syracuse and a lot of our folks there at Last Word on College Football, we had the discussion, and I posed the thought a couple of weeks ago: is there any chance that an undefeated Big 12 team, if their name is Baylor, would get left out of the playoffs? And kind of unequivocally, we all said no, and it was just kind of food for thought. And then last week I said, okay, I'm going to ask the question again. Do we think a Big 12 team named Baylor, now that they're behind 2 one-loss teams, could get put out? And I think left out. And I think a lot of us are like, yeah, it's possible. And and if you think about that, how ludicrous is that an undefeated? And now at the end of the day, to your point, beating Oklahoma twice, beating Texas, possibly Texas twice at the time. We thought that they might get in there, but that would be certainly would have been ludicrous. And to your point, I think it is a little bit of a blow to the Big 12. Having said that, Oklahoma is uniquely positioned, along with probably with what would have been Texas, to carry the mantle in terms of a 1-loss team to make it to the college football playoff. I think the one thing last week we talked a little bit about this. Oklahoma got a little bit of a bump with some of the teams that lost that helped them out. This week, it kind of happened opposite. Texas losing hurt. Kansas State losing at home to West Virginia, that hurt as well. So I think, they're still certainly got to win out, got to be impressive in winning out. I don't know that playing Baylor again does much for them. Since they beat them the first time, if they would have, I think probably the best scenario for Oklahoma would have been for Kansas State to win out, possibly play them again in the Big 12 championship game. But I think it's almost assuredly going to be Oklahoma and Baylor. I think from what I understand about the tiebreakers and where they're at right now in terms of the rankings and the standings within the Big 12, I think Baylor has to just win one of the two against either Texas or Kansas, and then Oklahoma the same way. And then they whether it be TCU or Oklahoma State in 2 weeks. So I think Oklahoma, should Oklahoma go undefeated the rest of the way, I think they're probably on the outside looking in. Kind of, I mean, I think it really depends. If Oregon and Utah go into their Pac-12 championship game undefeated, I think if Oregon wins that game, they're probably the clear number 4. If Utah wins that game, there's a little bit of a discussion, I guess. I think that probably comes there. And then what does the committee make of Alabama now at this point without Tua? If they go and beat Auburn with Mac Jones at quarterback, what does that do? So I mean, you probably got about 3 or 4 teams fighting for number 4, and this is just assuming LSU goes and beats Georgia in the SEC championship game. What happens if Georgia wins? Then obviously they get the playoff spot, and LSU will not. I mean, drop out of the top 4. So, you've got that. You've got a lot of chaos that could happen, and of course, I think us college football fans, I think we like to see that chaos happen. If there was a 2 SEC teams that made it in the college football playoff, and a 1-loss Big 12 champion and a 1-loss Pac-12 champion, especially if it's Oregon that gets left out, that could bring some momentum pretty quickly towards an expansion.
Yeah, bring me chaos. Bring me Clemson losing to South Carolina or an ACC championship game, preferably, because then they're not a conference champion. Right. Give me Minnesota winning the Big Ten, and I could go on and on. But you're right. You're laying out a scenario that's very conceivable, that the west of Louisiana gets left out of the college football playoff, and it's Ohio State, Clemson, LSU, and Georgia in the playoff.
Yeah, and it's the way Georgia plays defense, it's not inconceivable, right? I mean, at this point, Georgia is they were very impressive, against Auburn, at least for 3 quarters at least, right? They played really well, and then LSU, they have the last couple of weeks they've seemed to develop a little bit of a 2018 Oklahoma defensive problem in terms of they gave up, what was it, 37 to Mississippi on Saturday, and then obviously in the 40s to Alabama. So, yeah, I mean, it's not, and Oregon even plays, I believe they play at Arizona State, so it's not inconceivable that they lose that game. So, even though, I think most people, when you look at Oklahoma, they're a little bit on the outside looking in, number 10. I would expect tonight they'll probably be in the 8 or 9 range. Kind of depending on how the committee values that win Saturday over Baylor. Maybe they don't value it a whole lot, seeing that they were number 13, being undefeated. But, there's still a lot, in 3 weeks, 2 regular season weeks, and then the championship weekend to play. So there's a lot of chaos that could ensue. But right now, certainly they need a few things to happen to go their way to get back there.
And for those folks that are going to disregard the TCU game, let's keep in mind that TCU is just 5-5. But after an early season loss to Iowa State by 25 points, they've lost all these games by 1 score. Yeah. They took Baylor to overtime. If you know the theatrics of what happened in that game, that was a crazy game that basically at one point, Max Dugan, I think it was, at quarterback for TCU, basically scored a touchdown that would have ended the game, but he stepped out of bounds by about that much. Yep. And Baylor would have been done. Baylor didn't make a play. He just stepped out of bounds. Otherwise, TCU wins that game. They just beat Texas Tech by 2. They've played in the 3 to 4 games that overlap Oklahoma's games against the same opponents. They've played reasonably close to what Oklahoma did against the same opponents, other than that Iowa State game that was their first Big 12 encounter. So this may not be a walkover. Of course, this is a Kerry Patterson team that took a couple of years to acclimate themselves to the Big 12. Then for 3 to 4 years were as good as anybody in the Big 12. Of course, could have made the playoffs in 2014. Most recently in 2017, matched up with Oklahoma in the Big 12 championship game. Now they've kind of cycled down the last 2 years at 7-6 and now 5-5. But TCU and Gary Patterson, they're going to give it a puncher's shot.
Yeah, I think we both kind of put the no pun intended. We put the cart before the horse a little bit here with our, with kind of talking about the playoff. Absolutely. TCU is, especially Norman. They seem to play Oklahoma pretty tough. even more so when they're kind of perceived to be a little bit down. So Oklahoma's certainly going to have to play. They're probably, if not the best, one of the top 2 or 3 defenses in the Big 12. Probably along with Iowa State and Oklahoma, at least season long, being the toughest defenses in the Big 12. So yeah, Oklahoma's going to have to come to play. I think they've not played a full game. They've probably not played a full 4 quarters since probably the Texas game. Honestly, Mark, Kansas State, I don't know that they even played 1 quarter. Iowa State, they played great for the first half, and then second half was bad. Certainly the fourth quarter was bad. And then obviously last week the first half was atrocious, and then the second half was probably the best half of football they've played all year. I would say so. If they can put two halves together, I think they can probably win this 10 to 17 points fairly comfortably, maybe even more. But if they look at the 5-5 record, if they kind of think that they can throw off their helmet and play, if for whatever reason they're looking ahead to Bedlam next week, then they could certainly have a fourth quarter on their hands.
Yeah, it was my thought coming into the season that aside from Oklahoma and Texas, if I was looking for one team to possibly be a dark horse to make it, I did not really consider seriously, I've got to admit, Baylor. I was thinking Iowa State and TCU. And TCU, I just thought, man, if they could get some quarterback play, their 2 most prolific players, both rushing and receiving, have been around a long time. Were proven productive players in Jalen Rieger and in Darius Anderson. Both those guys have had good seasons. And they had the defense in line as one of the better ones, as you just mentioned, in the Big 12, that I thought, man, if they can get reasonable quarterback play, then they might be able to take a shot at it. Max Duggan had 15 touchdowns and 7 picks this year at about 56% completion percentage, which in this day and age typically is not going to get the job done. So they've been a little ineffective, of course, at quarterback, and that's been an issue. All right, Jason, we appreciate you stopping by, breaking down the TCU game, the Oklahoma situation there, coming off the big win against Baylor. And we will certainly want to reel you back for Bedlam, as you alluded to just a second ago, because that could be a whole lot of fun, again, with Oklahoma State. Maybe they're the 3rd best team in the Big 12 this year, and they'll certainly want to spoil Oklahoma's season. Absolutely. Jason, we appreciate you stopping by, sir.
All right, thanks for having me, Mark. I appreciate it.